I think one of the most exciting things to me about this seminar is just the quality of people that are here. I know that Wednesday when I came in to register for the leadership conference, there were 4 people lined up in front of me. And there was one who was from Tokyo, there was one who was from Johannesburg, one from Stockholm, and one from Mexico City. And how many places can you go in the United States or in the world today and have the 4 people in front of you be from 3 different continents of the world, from 4 different major cities of the world, and for all of them to be Christians and for all of them to be missionaries? I mean, it blows my mind to think that that's happening right now. And 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it would have just been beyond comprehension. Something like that. In Boston, Massachusetts, of all places in the world, that you can have that happening. And yet, what we're witnessing is something I think that God has had a vision for in every single generation since that first century. See, that's what He really wants to happen. And if you didn't get to see the play Upside Down, of course you got just a glimpse of it last night and you'll get a little more of a glimpse of it tonight. But if you haven't gotten to see it, be sure you get to see the video, because it is just absolutely incredible seeing the book of Acts come to life in a period of 4 hours there. And what you really begin to understand is that what happened there in the book of Acts was a movement. It was a movement of God that was extremely radical and extremely dynamic. And I think we need to realize the same thing, is that we're part of a movement. And we need to expect it to be radical. We need to expect it to be dynamic. We expect it to be changing. And that's one of the things that just characterizes, I think, Boston and other multiplying ministries is change. You know, sometimes I'm afraid to go away and leave Boston because I come back a few days later and things have changed. But we need to be flexible. We need to be radical in being ready to adapt to every circumstance and condition. And that means that there are ideas that are changing that we need to be able to adapt to. And one of the things that I really want to challenge you with today are some ideas that you may not be very comfortable with. You may not really have thought about some of these things before, but I think it's critically important that at this time we deal with this question of authority and submission. It's a very important issue, and it's an issue, quite frankly, today is dividing the church. And the gap is widening between multiplying discipling ministries and the rest of the churches of Christ, and it's primarily over this one question of authority and submission. And so it's extremely important that we not just talk about it, but we study it out the way that Mike talked about, that we really be into the Bible and we study out these questions. I think even the words authority and submission, when you hear them, what comes to mind? Doesn't it really conjure up sort of negative images? You think of authority and you think, of the policeman, the state trooper with the badge. You think of the police car with a flashing red light pulling up behind you. We don't get good pictures in our minds when we think about authority and we think about submission. But we've got to recognize that authority and submission are words that God invented. They are principles that God invented, and therefore they must be good. And the fact that we don't have good images in our minds is because we haven't dealt in the correct way and had the correct understanding of authority and submission, and we haven't applied it in the right ways. I want to start out as the first point talking about something that I call the umbrella of authority. The umbrella of authority. Basically, as Christians, God has given us 5 areas of authority that we're called to submit to. The first of these areas is found in Romans chapter 13. And I would like for you to really take some careful notes, because you're not going to be able to absorb all this right now, although I do want you to turn and read the scriptures with me, but I also want you to use this as some subjects for quiet times over the next few weeks. Study these things out because they are critically important to what we're about. Romans chapter 13. Paul writes to the church in Rome, beginning in verse 1. He says that everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment to themselves. Now, what's Paul saying here? Well, first of all, Paul is writing to a group of Christians here in Rome that, guess what? They're being persecuted. And who are they being persecuted by? They're being persecuted by the Roman government. I mean, it's already getting to the point in time that some Christians are losing their lives in Rome because the government is cracking down on the Christians. And so what's Paul's admonition to the Roman Christians? He says, hey guys, I want you to submit to the governing officials. Surely not, Paul. You don't understand. They're killing us. No, you don't understand. You don't understand that they're there because God put them there. You see, all authority that exists because God established the authority. The Roman government, the Caesars, those homosexual Caesars were there because God raised them up as the governing officials. You may say, well, why did he do it? It's because God had a purpose. And his purpose is not always clear to us, but he had a purpose. Listen with me while I read Habakkuk. Habakkuk's written by the prophet to the people who are really not following God because of their idolatry. And Habakkuk is writing, he starts out, he doesn't understand why the terrible things are happening to them that are happening. He says in verse 2, how long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you don't listen. Or cry out to you violence, but you don't save. Habakkuk says, why, God? Why are you allowing this to happen? But then God says down in verse 5, he says, look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you wouldn't believe even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. And then Habakkuk's response in verse 12, O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we won't die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. What the writers are saying here is that authority is from God. You see, God rules the nations. God ruled the nations in the Old Testament. God ruled the nations in the New Testament, and God still rules the nations. And that's the reason there is no one of us that has the right to take the law in our own hands. Because when we do, we're not rebelling against governmental authority. We're rebelling against God. Because all authority is from God. Now, how does that apply to us? Well, basically, all of us have certain laws of government that we don't particularly like, and quite often are very infrequently don't really help us do what we want to be doing. They're inconvenient. For instance, there are many times that we're late for appointments. And it would really help if we could drive 15 or 20 miles an hour faster than the posted speed limit. Guess what? Doing that is rebellion against God. There are certain laws that may seem dumb. It doesn't matter. God appointed the leaders, and we are called to submit. Now, are there any exceptions? Yeah, we've got two exceptions. The first exception is if government calls us to do something that is against the written will of God. God's law is always superior to man's law. And so that's an exception. The second exception is any time that we're called to violate our conscience. Paul says that anything that is not of faith is sin. But those are the only two exceptions that I know of to not keeping laws handed down by men. Governmental authority. The second area of authority is Ephesians chapter 6. Paul writes here, and this is, quite frankly, the most difficult area of authority for me to understand. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Paul says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters." How? With respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eyes on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he's a slave or free. Surely not, Paul. Surely not submitting to slavery. Paul says yes. Why? Because authority is from God. Does God love slavery? No, I don't think God loves slavery at all. But God saw that the point was not to try to overthrow, because what happens when you try to overthrow? You use force, either physical or mental or emotional force. And what does that accomplish? The exact opposite of what we're trying to accomplish as Christians, and that is leading people to the Lord. You never lead people to anything by forcing them, as in rebellion. You see, God hates rebellion. One of the most detestable sins to God is rebellion. Rebellion against any type of authority, even authority of slave masters. And Paul doesn't say, well, you do just enough to get by. You submit when people are watching you, but you go ahead and act like a free man the rest of the time. He says, no, you submit as though you're a slave for Christ, and you're with Christ and you're serving him all the time. That's the attitude you have. You do it from the heart. You don't do it outwardly. You do it from the heart. See, that's what submission is. Submission is an attitude, and it has to come from the heart. The third area is just up a few verses, chapter 5, verse 22. It says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he's the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit to their husbands in everything." Now, we understand that. I think we've come to grips probably with that. But you see what he's saying here? He says, wives, you're going down, he says, wives, respect your husbands. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But you do it as to the Lord. You serve, you submit, as though you're submitting to Jesus Christ himself. Then down chapter 6, verse 1. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." We understand that one well. But that's the fourth area of submission in this umbrella of authority. We submit, we honor, we obey our parents. The final one is Hebrews chapter 13. And this is the one that seems to give us the most problems. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. Obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so that their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that would be of no advantage to you. You see what the writers have laid out here? 5 areas of authority. First of all, to government. Secondly, obeying masters. Thirdly, wives submitting to husbands. Fourthly, children obeying parents. And finally, submitting and obeying spiritual leadership. Now, this is the one, quite frankly, that seems to cause Christians the most problems. I don't totally understand it. We seem to have sort of worked through the first 4 areas, but it's this 5th area that seems to cause problems. And in the church today, there is a major battle going on against authority. I don't know how much you're aware of it, but there are large segments of the Church of Christ today that are even saying that evangelists don't have authority, and they're saying that elders don't have authority. And they point out that, first of all, in the Greek, this word authority is not there. And they say that this word obey that's used here in verse 17 is really a Greek word that means be persuaded. And so what they're saying is that really all you have the right to do as a leader is to lead from a position of having a great example, and people respecting your example so much that they want to follow you. And so they totally strip authority away from the spiritual leaders. But let's first of all just look at this, the word used here for obey. And the way I want to do that is to look at another verse in the New Testament that uses exactly the same Greek word, and all you have to do is flip over a couple of pages to James chapter 3. James here in James chapter 3 is talking about the tongue and being able to tame the tongue. And he uses an analogy here in verse 3. And he says, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. See, the word obey there, the Greek word used in the word obey, is exactly the same Greek word that was used in Hebrews 13:17. And so the principle is the same. And so he's saying, okay, you persuade the horse to turn with a bit in his mouth. Does that mean that you say, nice horsey, would you please turn? Of course not. If you're riding that horse, you expect that horse to turn. And you'll pull on that rein until he turns, and if he doesn't turn with a slight nudge, you'll pull it harder. You're going to persuade the horse, but the horse is going to turn. You see, there's a sense of authority that rider has over that horse, and he's going to take that horse where he needs to go. Now, I don't want to take that analogy too far from spiritual leadership. I mean, we're not riders of horses here. But you understand the point, that what the writer of Hebrews is really saying is, he's telling us a form of the way that we really ought to lead as spiritual leaders. We ought to use a persuasive leadership. I mean, that's always the best way to lead people, isn't it? I mean, husbands, hopefully we've learned that lesson, that we don't lord it over. We're told as spiritual leaders we don't lord it over, but you still need to lead from a position of authority. And we've got to understand, this is in God's plan. This is God's plan. And this umbrella of authority is from God. It's not a bad thing. See, God has designed us as people to be, first of all, submissive. And God has established an order of things that all of us in every area of our lives are, first of all, submissive. Now, we need to understand that the world tries to take advantage of this, and they always want to rise to the top so they can be the big guy so they can tell people what to do. Of course, that's not obviously what we need to be doing in the spiritual sense or in any of these senses, as we'll talk about a little bit later. I want to just say something here that may be a new concept to you. And that is, I think most of us understand the role of elders. and the role that elders really need to be taking and playing in our churches. Let me just see a show of hands. How many of you are in congregations that have elders? Okay, probably about half of you. Okay, that means that probably half of you are in congregations that do not have elders. So what do you do there? Who has the authority of leadership in a situation like that? Well, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I believe it's really true, we've adopted sort of a Western democratic mindset and said, well, if we don't have elders, what we'll do is we'll select this steering committee, this board of spiritual men, and we'll let them sort of lead us by sort of voting. In other words, we moved in the direction of leadership by vote, a sampling of a select group of people decide which direction we want to go. Let me say that that was never the mode that was used in New Testament leadership. I mean, people will say, well, look at Acts 15, the Jerusalem conference. I mean, wasn't that a consensus group? No, I think if you read it carefully, what you'll find out is they brought these people in here, the apostles and the elders listened to them. But you know what happens there? It is they've heard it all, and James said, here's my judgment. He says, this is what we need to do. See, it was James who really made the judgment there. They didn't take some consensus vote. Now, they all supported it. But I think that we've missed the boat, and I think we're so adapted to a Western mindset and culture that we think that everything needs to be done democratically. You got to remember that even here in Jerusalem at this time, in the whole New Testament times, it's an Eastern mindset. And we don't think naturally the way that people in that part of the world think. I didn't realize that until I took a trip this last year to Bombay and to Tokyo. Those people's mindsets are totally different than our mindsets. Now, that doesn't make it necessarily right, but it made me start reading and looking for some different things in the New Testament, and I think that I've really found some of those things. Turn over with me to Titus chapter 1. I just want to talk just a few moments about the role of an evangelist. Titus chapter 1, Paul writes to Titus in verse 5. He says, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. Okay, what's happened here? Well, if you remember, when Paul was on the way to Rome, they stopped off for a while there in Crete. And some congregations were set up in the time. You know, everywhere Paul went, he set up congregations. It didn't matter if he was a prisoner or whatever it was. He always used the opportunity. And so he started some congregations there, but he left them in their infancy. And so what he does then, he writes to Titus, and he says, Titus, I need for you to go back there to those churches on the island of Crete, and I want you to straighten out the things in those churches that need to be straightened out, and I want you to appoint elders in each of those churches. Now, that's very interesting. Here's an evangelist, Titus, who sent in to existing churches, said, I want you to go straighten things out. Not just sent into one church, but a whole group of churches. To, number one, straighten things out and appoint elders. I think that we need to understand that maybe the role of evangelist is a lot broader than what we've looked at in the past. For some reason, I don't totally understand in the Restoration movement how we've come to the role and the position of preachers that we've come to. But how do we sort of view preachers traditionally in the church today? Aren't they men who are sort of hired and fired by whoever's in leadership? I mean, if they do a good job, we'll even renew their contract. A lot of churches even have contracts with preachers. If they do a good job, man, we'll extend their contract. We may even give them a raise. If they don't do a very good job, we'll put them on probation, and we may even have to fire them. And so we'll go out and look for some other preacher to hire and bring in. So they're sort of like employees of the congregation. I want to suggest to you, I want you to read this for yourself and study it out. There is no sense whatsoever of evangelists in the New Testament being employees of anyone except God. And they were commissioned to go into churches to do specific things that I believe that we've totally missed the boat on, and I think that we've tied their hands in too many situations. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16, I won't take time to turn over there, but it talks about the whole body being joined and linked together by every supporting ligament. And I've used that verse in a lot of sermons to talk about local congregations, and I think it's very applicable there. And what I normally use there for the ligaments is relationships. In your local congregation, it's really relationships between brothers and sisters that really bind the body together. But you know, in the context of Ephesians chapter 4, he's not talking about local congregations. He's talking about the church worldwide. And he says somehow in this universal body, there are ligaments that tie it all together. And I think the same thing is true. I think those ligaments are relationships. And somehow we've come up with this idea through the years that each congregation is sort of autonomous. We've even invented this word autonomous. It doesn't appear in the Bible. That each congregation is autonomous. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that it's self-governing, but it's also sort of independent from everyone else. Now, I do believe that each congregation is self-governing. It's supposed to have its own leaders. But I think we've made too much a sense of independence between churches, because when you look at the relationships between churches in the New Testament, they were very interdependent. I mean, you look at the church in Jerusalem's relationship with the church in Antioch. You look at the church in Antioch's relationship with all the churches that Paul started. They had relationships. Now, what were the ligaments in those situations? I suggest that the ligaments that you find in those situations were the evangelists that kept going back and forth between all those congregations. Those were the common ties. And it was all done out of relationship. Because it was Paul who went in and actually started those churches. He became their fathers in the faith. But Paul would just sort of indiscriminately say, okay, Titus, you need to go over here and service this church. Timothy, I want to send you over here. Silas, you need to run over here and do this. And those people, these evangelists, were welcomed with open arms. Now, how do you suppose those evangelists interacted with those churches that had elders? There aren't many verses in the Bible that show the relationship between evangelists and elders. There are very few, but you know what? That every one of them that you find are not what we expect. Because first of all, what happens? Evangelists are to appoint elders. Also, evangelists are to accept charges against elders. Evangelists are to publicly rebuke elders. You don't ever find a situation of elders doing something to evangelists. Now, what does that suggest? Does it suggest perhaps that we've got the order wrong in the sense of authority? I really believe that we have. And in fact, if you look at Ephesians 4, even the order of the offices of the church, what do you have? He gave some first to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then pastor-teachers. So I think we need to restudy this question and see if we've not been far too restrictive in our role and the way that we've used evangelists. Even from a reasoning standpoint, it sort of makes sense, because once we start to understand discipling and the discipling process, you know, it's really sort of the evangelist in the sense of a church planting who raises up elders. See, he disciples elders, men almost from conversion. He disciples them into leadership, into maturity, and then he appoints them as elders. Does it make any sense on the day that he appoints them as elders, he suddenly starts being discipled by them? I mean, you don't switch relationships like that. That discipling relationship is still going to continue. But see, it comes out of relationship. It comes out of relationship. And I think these evangelists need to serve a very important role in the church today in the same way that it formed a very important role in the church in the first century. What do I mean by that? Well, I think probably in the last year what we've started to see is a real formation of a sense of brotherhood, of unity, that really didn't exist this time last year. God has worked in an incredible way in the past 12 months. And quite frankly, I believe that one of the reasons, brothers and sisters, is because the subject of our seminar last year was on prayer. And I think that it's called us to a deeper dependence on God than we've ever had before. And I think as a result of that, we've had a coming together of many, many congregations saying, hey, let's cut out the competition. Let's cut out, okay, we got to hurry up and target this city because it may be gone tomorrow. Somebody else may target it. And let's start working as brothers with a sense of brotherhood. We're going to take this world and this generation. And what we really began to see is some interlinking of congregations primarily happening because of the evangelists. Well, give me an example. Well, this spring, Tom Brown in San Francisco decided, hey, I really need more training. I just don't know how to take the Berkeley church a lot further than it is now. Now, he built a great church there by the power of God. And he said, would you send someone, an evangelist from Boston, into San Francisco while I'm in Boston? And so we decided we'd send Scott Green there for those few months. Now, Scott is leading the Hong Kong team. And so he went to San Francisco in June. In June, they had 17 baptisms in San Francisco. Now, that's good, but that's not great. Their goal this year is daily conversions. And so that was just a little more than half the pace. But in July, they had 67 baptisms in San Francisco. They've had an incredible summer. They've baptized 100 people in the last 50 days. And Scott and Lynn have done a fantastic job there. They just recently came back to Boston. And so then, by that time, Tom said, hey, I really don't know how to do it, and I can't get in 2 months. I need to stay in Boston for as long as it takes. And so would you send someone else to San Francisco since Scott and Lynn have to go to Hong Kong? Well, who could it be? We looked around and said, well, Frank and Erica Kim in Paris have done a fantastic job, and they recently have decided what they want to do is take the team and lead the team to Tokyo. But it's going to take a while to collect that team. What if we take them out of Paris and send them to San Francisco for that time? And that's what we've done. Now, it makes a lot of sense because San Francisco, number one, is already interested in Asia. They already had a goal of Manila and Seoul. And there are a lot of Orientals in San Francisco, and so there will be a lot converted there that can even go on the team back to Tokyo. But you see what's happening? That because of this evangelist from Paris, who was originally from Boston, going to San Francisco, he's going to tie into San Francisco in a way that for years to come, there are going to be relationships there. And then he's going to go from there, taking some people from there with him to Tokyo. And in fact, San Francisco probably will even support that work financially for years to come. And so you've got links now between Boston and San Francisco through Scott Green and Frank Kim, but also with Asia. And so you've got ligaments forming here. That's just one example. But with these evangelists moving between congregations and so forth, you're going to have a real brotherhood and a sense of brotherhood being built. And I think that really gets exciting when we see that really happening. Well, one of the reactions that most people have to this thing of authority and being called to submit to authority, especially in the area of spiritual authority, is, well, what about the question of Christian freedom? I mean, we're supposed to be free in Christ, and here you're calling me to submit to another man. I mean, that just doesn't seem right because you're giving up freedoms. That sort of makes sense until you realize that we don't think that way in any of those other four areas. Do you feel like you've lost Christian freedom because you submit to government? No, most people don't have a problem with that. Or do you give up Christian freedom because you submit to your parents? No, never thought of that. Do wives really give up Christian freedoms by submitting to their husband? No. Well, why is it that we give up Christian freedoms if we submit to spiritual leaders? See, that's just humanistic thinking to think that we're giving up Christian freedoms, and in fact, the opposite is true. Because it's God who invented authority and submission, and what you find out is that actually we become free. We become free when we really do it God's way. You know, when a wife submits to her husband in the way that God intended it, she's free because she's doing it God's way, the way God designed for it to be done. And it's the same way that He planned for it to be done in the church. Now, I think we need to understand that and believe that God rules the nations. You see, this only works because it's God's plan, and He enforces it. And He says, hey guys, if you'll just trust me, and if you'll get underneath this umbrella of authority, I'll take care of you. If you'll do it my way, I'll take care of you. I'll protect you. I'll even give you some promises like 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. I won't let anything happen to you that you can't bear up under. So just trust me and do it my way.
Now, once we understand that umbrella of authority, then we can deal with another area of authority that I call delegated authority. Now, what do I mean by delegated authority? I mean, well, it actually functions in any of these 5 areas of authority that I've talked about, is that you can delegate some of the authority that you have to other people. For instance, you understand it very well in the area of government. Government leaders are always delegating authority. For instance, the president will appoint ambassadors and say, Mr. So-and-so, I want you to be ambassador to France. So what he's going to do is delegate some of his authority. Now, how much does he delegate? Well, he defines how much he delegates, but he never delegates all of it. For instance, an ambassador can't declare war on someone. And so he always has a limited, defined amount of authority that's given to him by the one delegating authority. Same way in work, in the workplace. You understand that there. Some of you are here today who left responsible jobs that you have people under you in your jobs. And you may have left someone in charge of a group of people. You may have delegated some authority to them. Well, how did you do that? Well, you left them a defined amount of authority. So if here you are a boss of, say, a group of 20 people, and you say, okay, I want you to direct this group while I'm gone, you define very accurately, very specifically the authority. For instance, you probably don't give that guy the right to grant raises while you're gone, because he may give everybody a raise. And you don't give him the right to fire people, because he may fire one that's in his way. You rather give him specifically defined authority and limits on that authority. Same way with children. As parents, we understand that. When my children were younger, and our oldest daughter was old enough to babysit, it would be quite often that we would leave her in charge of our other 2 girls. And we would give her delegated authority. We would say, Stacy, here's the authority you have. And we'd tell the other girls, here's the authority she has. Now, when she tells you it's time to go to bed, you go to bed. And if you don't go to bed, you're going to have to answer to us when you get back. Now, we were very careful, again, to define that authority. We did not give her the right to book a trip to Disney World while we were gone, because she could have abused that authority. We rather defined it very carefully. Well, it works the same way in the church. You see, spiritual leaders who are given authority by God can delegate authority to other people. We really understand it. We do it all the time. For instance, if you're in a church who hires a youth minister, a minister to the teens, you delegate some authority to him. You give him a defined area to work in, and you tell him what he can and cannot do and what he can call the teens to do in a very defined way. Well, we do the same thing in discipling ministries. We delegate authority. As one of the elders of the Boston church, I will delegate authority to a house church leader. I will delegate authority to a Bible talk leader. I will delegate authority to a discipler in a discipling relationship. But it's always in a defined way. You see, it's not an unlimited authority. I don't have unlimited authority, but it's not unlimited in the sense that I have. For instance, I will never delegate the authority to a Bible talk leader or a house church leader to disfellowship someone. I'm not going to give that kind of authority to them. But I am going to give them the authority to call people to obey everything that Jesus taught. You see, I'm going to prescribe to them the authority that they have, and then expect the people that they are leading to follow them in the realm of authority that they have. They are called to submit to those people in that spiritual leadership that we've set up. Okay. Now, one of the things that we built in there, just because we understand that sometimes you may get an immature leader in there that you've delegated authority to, what we've also set up is what we call the right of appeal. And so if we set up, for instance, a discipling relationship, we don't want that perhaps young Christian in that relationship to feel like he's trapped. And so we give him the right, if he's called to do something that he just can't agree with, that he's got the right to appeal that to someone else, to someone in authority over the person discipling him. So we try to destroy in a situation where a person might be totally trapped in that situation. Now, one thing I need to point out, in all 5 areas of authority that I talked about, they're all parallels. if you really look at them and you don't understand one area of authority, you can look at another one and look at the principles of it, and they'll apply over here. And also exactly the same exceptions apply. The only two times you don't submit are if you're called to go against the will of God or if you're called to violate conscience. Any other time than that, you're called to submit. Even in matters of opinion, you're called to submit, see? It doesn't matter. Those only two exceptions are going against the will of God and violating your conscience itself. Okay, let's talk about the subject of submission. We've talked about authority. Let's talk about the flip side of submission. Let me first of all say what submission is not. Submission is not agreeing. Because if you agree, you don't have to submit. I mean, if the person over me in the Lord calls me to do a certain thing that I already wanted to do anyway, I don't have to submit to that. You know, if I tell Gloria, this afternoon I want you to go out and buy a new dress, guess what? She won't have to submit to that. Well, the only way she might have to submit to it if she wanted to go out and buy 2 new dresses. And I told her you can only buy 1. But we don't have to submit in areas that we already agree with it. So that's not submission just to give in on things you wanted to do anyway. Another thing that submission is just not outward conformity. Submission is not just doing what the person says you need to do and doing it outwardly, but in the side, really rebelling against it. It's just like what Paul talked about with slaves with respect to the masters. Don't just do it when they're watching. Don't just do the minimum requirement to get by. You do it from the heart. You do it wholeheartedly, as though you were doing it from the Lord. Now, my background is from the mainline Church of Christ. I grew up in the Church of Christ. And I love my brothers who are still in the mainline Church of Christ. But I know that there's something that tends to be characteristic of those who grew up with that background. There's some characteristics that we really have to fight to overcome. One of those is independence, and the other one is a lack of openness. Now, what I mean by lack of openness, I mean sort of not really saying what I'm feeling. And so if someone says something I don't really agree with, I'll tend to just sort of keep it to myself. Both of those are very dangerous characteristics in terms of being discipled. You cannot be a good disciple if you're independent and if you're unopen. See, discipling will only work when you're totally open with what you're feeling and what you're thinking. Now, another thing that submission is not conditional. It doesn't depend on how well the person calling me to submit is doing. It doesn't matter if they're just doing super awesomely spiritually. See, my call to submit is based on giving in to the authority of God, not how well someone else is doing. So I need to understand that, hey, I'm going to submit unconditionally as long as they don't call me to violate the will of God, and as long as they don't call me to go against my conscience, I'm going to submit. It's an attitude of heart on my part, not conditioned on anything that they do or they don't do. Now, another thing about submission that is extremely important, submission does not mean keeping quiet. And I think we miss this one a lot. Submission does not mean just sitting there and keeping quiet about what you may be thinking differently. And in fact, real submission to work right, you've got to be totally open. That's the reason I talked about being unopen is a dangerous thing. If I'm discipling someone and I say, brother, what you really need to do is this, and they're thinking something differently, I want to know about it. I don't want them to sit there and just be quiet. I do a lot of marriage counseling, and the main problem I always run into is a breakdown of communication between a husband and a wife. And you know what it usually is? The husband doesn't listen to the wife. And the wife shuts down and doesn't say what she's thinking. And so they have a bad relationship because, most of the time you don't even have to submit. If you're in a good relationship where you really are working together, you usually don't even have to submit because you talk things through and you come to a mutual agreement. Yeah, this is a great thing to do. This is what we really need to be doing. See, this is what we really ought to strive for in the church. It's what we ought to strive for in discipling relationships. But it's only going to work if we understand that it's not being insubordinate to say, I have a problem with this. And in fact, if you're discipling someone, you ought to develop the attitude, I want to know what you're thinking. Do you have a problem with what I just said? Let's talk about it. Let's try to work it out. I think one of the best examples that I know of in this is Kip McKean. Now, this really surprises a lot of people because they don't have, maybe Kip is such a strong person and such a strong leader, they don't think about Kip as being a great submissive person. But several months ago, Kip had planned a trip on Friday, and on Wednesday, Bob, the other elder, and myself were meeting together, and we got to talking about that trip and decided, really Kip doesn't need to make that trip. There were just some situations that come up. We just thought it was best that he didn't make the trip. And so that was a Wednesday evening. I went over to Kip's house about 11 o'clock that night, and Kip was in a meeting. I said, Kip, could we go downstairs and just talk for a few moments? We went downstairs, and I said, Kip, Bob and I have been talking, and we really decided it would be best if you canceled your trip on Friday. Kip's initial response was, it's done. Now could you tell me why? I mean, that attitude of submissiveness is just there. And see, it has to be there. You cannot disciple other people if you're not a great disciple yourself. If you don't know how to be submissive, you can't call other people to be submissive. Now, there's another thing about Kip that probably wouldn't surprise you. And that is if Kip had had a major problem about that, I would have known about it. And he needed to let me know about it if he had a major problem. And he would have fought long and hard about, hey, I feel like I really know it, need to do whatever. I mean, sometimes we'll go head to head. And that's a great discipling relationship. But you know what? When he's called to submission after he's been heard, Kip submits, and we'll leave that room, and no one will ever know that it wasn't totally unanimous to begin with that way. See, that's the attitude that we need to have, that attitude of submission. That's what bonds us together. That's what unifies us, being able to trust in that way. And you cannot teach what you are not. You've got to be submissive to be able to call people to submission. Now, one of the real dangers in discipleship and one of the real dangers in being submissive is this thing that I call filtering. Now, what do I mean by filtering? Again, it goes back to this unopenness thing. It's the idea if someone calls me to do something and basically I don't tell them what I'm feeling, but I just go away with what they've said and I pick and choose what I want to do and sort of throw out the rest, that's filtering. And you can never be a great disciple if you filter. Now, it's fine in the relationship to say, I don't like this and I do like this, as long as you're doing it with respect, and work through that. That's fine. You can do that. And you can be a great disciple doing that. But if you walk away without your discipler knowing what you're feeling, and you just pick and choose what you want to do, man, your independence will kill you as a disciple. And it will be bred into anybody you disciple. It's one of the most dangerous things that kills discipleship. You cannot have that independence. And you even understand in the world. I mean, let's take a school situation. Can you imagine if the student in the classroom taking calculus, the teacher, gives this homework assignment, and the student says, well, I like this problem, I'll do this, but I don't like this problem, I won't do this. And or this concept I like, but I don't like this concept. I mean, what kind of student is he going to be? He's not going to learn. See, it kills a learner's spirit. It kills a learner's attitude. And then basically the reason we fall into that is because we don't like conflict. It's easier to be quiet and walk away than it is to have the conflict that it takes to really work through it and work it out. The final thing I think we need in this area of submission is we need unconditional respect for the person who is over us in the Lord. You see, it is not an earned thing. It's interesting there in Ephesians 5 when Paul is talking about husband-wife relationships. What are husbands commanded to do? They're commanded to love their wives. What are wives commanded to do? Respect their husbands. See, it didn't say that if your husband is worthy of respect, respect him. No, you give him respect. See, respect is something you can decide to give another person. And that's what we need. If we're in a submissive posture, that's what we need to do. Is we need to learn to give respect. Otherwise, we'll fall back into this conditional submissiveness mode that will kill what we're trying to do. Well, what do you do about abusive authority? I mean, you're always going to run into situations where you've got abusive authority. How do you deal with that? Well, again, we've got a biblical example of how you deal with it. One of the most abusive situations you can find is Saul's relationship with David. I mean, here was Saul literally out trying to kill David. And what was David's response? Said, man, I can't touch this guy. He's anointed by God. You remember the time in the cave when Saul had gone into the cave and David and his forces were in the cave, and David went up and snipped a piece off his cloak? What did David do after that? He repented. He said, man, I can't be doing this. This guy has been appointed by God. David had the faith that God ruled the nations. God put Saul in that position, and he also believed that God could take Saul out of it. That's what you do with abusive authority, is you trust God. If you're under the umbrella of authority, you can trust God. He will take care of the situation. But you can say you don't understand. I mean, authority can get really abusive. Turn over to 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. Peter writes, "For if God didn't spare the angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment, if he didn't spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on his ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, who was distressed by the filthy lives of lawless men, if this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue godly men from trials, and how to hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment, while continuing their punishment. This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desire of the sinful nature and who despise authority." You see what God is saying here? God is saying, hey, I am big enough to take care of these situations. I took care of Noah. I took care of Lot. I took care of my children in Israel, even though the majority rebelled against me. I know how to take care of people in abusive situations, and I'll take care of you. You know what? What he's saying here is that some of you are going to die. Now, does that mean God's not taking care of them? No, not at all. See, God knows how to take care of us. And even if it means death in some circumstances, he's still taking care of us. Man, do you know a faster way to heaven? I'll guarantee you in that auditorium tonight in the Boston Garden, there are people in there who will die in the next few years as martyrs for Jesus Christ. I'll guarantee it. Because see, we're starting to move into parts of the world where it's going to happen. And we're not too far away of moving into parts of the Muslim world. And we're going to have people give their lives for the gospel of Christ. But God is still going to take care of them, even if he takes their life. See, God will protect us if we stay under his umbrella of authority. He's not going to let anything happen to us that we can't bear up under. It doesn't matter how abusive, how cruel the authority is, God will still take care of us and keep us true to God, and that's all that really counts. Now, one thing he has given us in the church to deal with abusive authority is Matthew chapter 18. And quite frankly, we need to use that more often than we do. God is not going to trap us in a situation where we have to lose our faith. See, that's the only thing that's important, is that we make sure that we're able to hold on to our faith and be true to him. Okay, let's look at the whole flip side of this thing now. We've talked about our responsibility of submitting to authority and submitting to leadership. What is the responsibility if we find ourselves in spiritual leadership? What should be the attitudes that we have? Well, let me tell you something. The authority-submission relationship works great when both sides do their part. If I am called to be submissive, if I will give unqualified respect and unqualified submission, and if the person over me in the Lord will do his part, then it's going to be a great relationship. But see, what it will be is a relationship. It's not a position. See, it's not a position of someone over me in the Lord and me in a position of someone under. It's a relationship. And when we see it as relationship, then it works beautifully. And again, the principles of authority work the same in marriage as they do in spiritual leadership. Husbands are to love their wives. Those in spiritual leadership are to love those under them. An unconditional love. It doesn't matter how bad they blow it. It doesn't matter if they're totally insubmissive. It doesn't matter if they're totally rebellious to God. I will love them unconditionally. Why? Because that's what Jesus did for me when I was totally rebellious. And so I'm called as a leader to be absolutely, totally, unconditionally loving to those in my charge. Now, that doesn't mean this mushy-gushy kind of love. It means a tough love. It means a love that will speak the truth in love, but always deciding what's best for the person that I'm really serving in that sense. You know, in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 44, we read the situation there, of course, where James and John come to Jesus and say, Jesus, when you come into power in your kingdom, can one of us sit on your right hand, one of us sit on your left hand? And of course, we know what happened there. The other 10 found out about it, and they become absolutely indignant that they didn't think of it first. But Jesus used that opportunity then to teach all 12 of them. He called them together and said, let me tell you something about authority. And let me tell you what it really means to lead and to be great in the kingdom. He says, now, I don't want you to lead like the Gentiles lead. I don't want you to lord it over people. I don't want you to use authority in the way they use authority. Because how does the world use authority? See, the world uses authority to get ahead. See, we've got this power pyramid in the world. And how do you measure success? The higher you walk in the world, the higher you climb in the pyramid, how do you measure it? The more people serve you. So if you get high enough in the job, you even have a black limousine pick you up for work. I mean, the measure of success is the number of people who serve you. And Jesus says, it's not going to be that way with you. And in fact, I'm going to take this power pyramid, I'm going to turn it upside down. And it's going to work exactly the opposite. And the greater you are in my kingdom, the more people you will be serving. See, that's the way. He's talking about servant leadership. It's an attitude that he calls us to be leaders who are servants. And he says, I'm going to give you an example. And that example is going to be me, Jesus Christ. See, I didn't come to the world to be served, but to serve others. And I'm going to serve as an example, as a model for you. And if you want to see how to lead, if you want to see how to use authority, you look at Jesus. Just go through the Gospels and look at all the examples of the ways that Jesus used authority. That didn't mean that he never commanded anybody to do anything. It didn't mean he didn't tell people to. He did that quite often. But the way that he did it was different than the way that the world did it. He never did it in a selfish way. He never did it in a way that would make him more comfortable to get ahead. He always did it in a way that would accomplish God's purposes and would help the people that he was actually leading himself. He was a servant, and that's what he really calls us to do. So in closing, what can we learn about this authority submission thing? First of all, we've got to believe that authority is from God. All authority is from God. Jesus said in Matthew 28, said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And any authority that exists, it comes from God. And we are called to submit to God's authority in any way, in any form that he delegates it. And so we as Christians are called to submit to authority. Because see, when we submit to authority, what we're actually doing is submitting to God. And let me just give you an attitude check here. If you're in a discipling relationship, or if you're in a situation in the local church where someone is over you in the Lord, a spiritual leader, and they ask you to do something, they call you a certain direction, and if your attitude is, what right do you have to be telling me to do anything, you've missed it. And in fact, you are in rebellion to God. See, the attitude that we need to have was actually the attitude that Mike talked about in the speech this morning. We need to have the attitude of, will you help me? You know, you're really a gift to God, from God to me. Will you help me? Will you help me grow? Can I submit to you? Will you teach me? Will you train me what you know? teach me what you know, because, see, I want to become more and more like Jesus. And God can use you to teach me how to become more like Jesus. See, there's not a person in this world that if I've got an attitude the way that Jesus wants me to have, that I can't